All right, I'm going to start this up. So first, hello. Thanks for coming. You've already listened to me once this week, and you get to do it again on Friday. So thank you for taking the time to listen yet again. What I'm going to do is we have a relatively long, I think it's a 2.5-hour presentation from Patrick Masson. And Patrick talks a lot about both the origins of open source and the philosophies of open source. And he does a very good job of it. And I'll introduce, who Patrick is in just a minute. What I've done is I've taken that and I've stripped it down to about a third, I think. We'll get into a little bit of some of the precursor material, but mainly I want to give you guys the tools you need to make a good choice on picking a license or convince you that licenses are necessary, and this just isn't a make work step for us. So let's kind of get started here. This is Patrick's slides. It's the importance and value of open source licenses. And it's fortunately licensed itself via the Creative Commons license. So as long as I tell you that I stole this from Patrick, and that, all the stuff that's correct is his and all the stuff that is incorrect is probably mine, we're actually obeying the license, and hopefully, everybody's kind of good with that. Are you guys okay? So we are hearing me. I don't need this. I'm probably not recording. No, it's working. Okay. I was worried that I wasn't recording the video, the sound, but it looks like it's recording. All right. So the value and importance of open source licenses. Patrick is now doing some adjunct teaching at the State University of New York, but he is previously the director of the Open Source Initiative, and he has a good track record in technology. If you look at the Open Source Initiative, the OSI's webpage, that's their logo, by the way, it'll tell you they're in San Jose, California, and that is largely true. But their director actually was working remotely for many years out of Albany, New York office. So we were able to get Patrick, while he was director, to come to campus and talk to us multiple times. And I have multiple iterations of this presentation, each of which is getting longer and longer, and more detailed, and he has more and more examples of bad open source, or open source, or things that masquerade as open source, and that's kind of why it's important to make sure that we have these licenses, so that we're not doing a bait and switch. One of the reasons that it's good to have these licenses is so we're not doing a bait and switch on people. People know what they're getting when they use our software. And our software actually upholds certain principles. It's just not, I want to make my code available. It's, here's my code, here's its availability, and these are the principles that we're going to stand by when we're actually going to release it. Way back in the long ago, probably around 1989, I think it was, Richard Stallman, I believe, was largely responsible for this, maybe solely responsible for this. He came up with GNUs, and GNU stands for, GNU is not Unix, it's recursive, infinitely recursive, in fact. But he came up with the 4 essential freedoms that he believed every software program should have. And by the way, this comes out of the environment that he was working in. He was at MIT. They were used to getting software from vendors for free, essentially, because you were paying huge amounts for the iron that it ran on. So the companies, the software was just to get you to buy the iron. So they were used to getting things for free. But in one of these iterations of getting new hardware, or getting an update to their operating system, they lost the ability to communicate with a printer from Xerox that they had access to for a long time, and they were no longer able to modify the code to make the printer do what they wanted. There's a long story associated with this, but this set Richard Stallman off down this path of why that was unconscionable, why that was an affront to freedom, and what he came up with were these 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0, and we are computer scientists by and large, or at least we have to talk to them. So we're going to start at 0. The first freedom is, when you get software, you should have the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. So once I sell you a piece of software, or once you acquire a piece of software from me, this basically says that it's up to me to determine how I want to use it. You can't be policing my use of something that you've given me to use. The second freedom is I have the right to study how the program works. I have the right to make sure, essentially, this makes sure that you're not spoofing me, that you didn't embed something bad, that I can actually see and verify to the extent I want to that the code actually does what I want it to do, and nothing else. And also, I should have the ability to have it been given your ideas being expressed in code. I should have the right to change it to do my computing as I wish. Right? So if I have something else I want it to do, like a Xerox printer isn't doing exactly what I want it, I should have the ability to modify the software and then, and make it do what I want. And in order to do that in any practical sense, right, we do have reverse compilers, and you can go in and generate source code from object code. But really, that's a very difficult and very prohibitive thing to do. So if you're going to do this in any meaningful way, you actually need to have access to the source code. So this is the direction Stallman is coming at this from. Access to the source code is not just a nice thing to do. He's saying that there's these essential freedoms that apply, just like the Declaration of Independence in the United States. There are essential freedoms that everybody has, and to violate these freedoms, in order to enable those freedoms, these things have to be enabled. You have to be able to get the source code. And if you don't allow these freedoms, then you are, essentially assaulting fundamental principles of fairness and liberty. The freedom 2, after I've done this, after I've taken the code that I got from you and modified it or not modified it, I should be able to give it to other people. Right? Again, he's coming from a place where software was largely, that's how software transferred around. But from his concept, data expressed, algorithms expressed, need to be free and need to be put out into the world. And then the last freedom is the freedom to distribute copies of the first freedom is distributed unmodified copies, and the third freedom is to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. Okay, and for freedom 3 and freedom 1, you really do need to have access to the source code, and that's kind of the basis for this whole open source movement. This, by the way, Stallman would not characterize himself as an open source. He would be free source or Libre source. We'll talk just slightly about the differences between the two, in a few minutes, I guess. All right, so that was apparently 1989. It looks like that 1989 flowed down onto the next page when I remodified this. Okay, and one of the first, and this license is a Netscape public license. It was, one of the first licenses that actually came out. It's a source code license. It came out when Mozilla decided to make their Netscape software public. So it essentially gives you a worldwide royalty-free, non-exclusive license to use, reproduce, modify, display, perform, sublicense, and distribute the original code or portions thereof with or without modifications or as part of a larger work. So basically, I think the GNU licenses came out first, but this is a Mozilla license that essentially hits all of these buttons, right? You can run the program, you can study it and change it, and you can have access to the source. when I converted this to PDF, these things didn't come out good. But these are just a lot of organizations that have or support open source licenses. Okay, this is not good. Hold on just a second, please. I'm going to try something. I'll keep talking while I'm doing it, but I uploaded this to Google. And apparently when I uploaded it to Google, it did not take. So we are going to try something else. I did all my modifications on one machine, and now I'm trying to run it on another, and that's kind of giving me slight issues. Sorry about this. Give me just a second here. What I'm doing right now is I'm trying to go through and actually get the original one available. I had done it on another machine. I uploaded it to Google Docs as a PDF, and that is obviously not working for me. Almost there. I hope. All right, sorry about that. We're just gonna. I've got a new version, and hopefully the pictures actually show up. I should have noticed right from the start that the pictures weren't showing up correctly. There we go. All right, so this was what the importance and value of open source licensing slide should have looked like. This is what the GNU Essential Freedoms should have looked like. And GNU has basically three primary licenses, AGPL, LGPL, and GPL3. This is what the Netscape public license should have looked like. And now we're down into Debian. So back in 1989, Richard Stallman put forth his manifesto, his four freedoms, and then by 1998, and he came out with I believe it was just the GPL at that point, and it was GPL1 obviously, or even before that. And then in 1998, Netscape open sourced their browser. They came out with the Netscape public license. And again, it's basically gives you the right to do whatever you want. And there may be some certain restrictions down below. The Netscape public license is probably now the Mozilla public license, and still lives on. And then somewhere along the line, Debian, which is a distribution of Linux, came out and reformulated the four freedoms of Richard Stallman into 10 actual guidelines. They called the Debian Free Software Guidelines. So any software that was going to be included in the Debian release had to actually abide by these four guidelines. And again, that was 1997. And that led in 1998 to the open source definition. And the open source definition is the definition used by the OSI. And it basically, for the first 9 freedoms, essentially parallels the Debian guidelines. I think they differ a little bit in the 10th one, but these are, Debian. I don't remember what the Debian 10th one is, but they differ a little bit in the 10th one. But the first 9 are essentially the same, and we can go to the OSI open source definition. Right, and we can come in and come into the OSD, the OSI, get the OSD, right, and it's still available here. So you have free redistribution, right? You can give away the code. That essentially parallels, one of Stallman's freedoms. Must include source code, must allow modifications in derived works, integrity of the author's source code. Basically, the author can insist that can't insist that you not modify the code, but he can insist that you call out what's different between his code and yours. There's a no discriminations clause. Again, that was one of the freedoms, or part of one of the freedoms was that anybody can use it for anything. I think that was freedom 0, even. No discrimination against fields of endeavor. Well, you can't discriminate against groups. You can't discriminate against what they want to do with it. And then the rights have to attach to all to whom the code is redistributed, right? So I don't have to, if I give it to you, you don't have to go back to a third party and get prior approval. The approval travels with the code. So it has to be such that the person receiving the code doesn't have to do anything else in order to receive the benefits. Can't restrict others, may not be specific to a product. So in other words, if I have some open source stuff and I distribute it with my closed source product, I can't say that the open source stuff only applies when it's within that product. I have to, you have to be able to separate that out from my product and put it in your product and make it work. And again, it can't restrict other software. And then the 10th one is technology neutral. I can't remember what the Debian was, but it essentially says that, it doesn't matter you can't just say, you can only use this on Windows 10 or something like that, or DOS or something like that. It has to be technology neutral. 9 is a big one. The license must not place restrictions on other software that is being distributed along with the licensed software. For example, the license must not insist that all other programs distributed on the same medium must be open source. And what you'll find is that in things like the server-side public license that Mongo just tried to do, that's where you start running into problems. You're starting to require that in order to use your open source software, your open source in quotes, other people have to make all of their stuff open as well. The open source has to be encapsulatable as a piece. And that's kind of where we start getting into issues. And actually, let's point out a couple issues that you're going to see. This discrimination against persons or groups, or discrimination against fields of endeavor, these are pretty big. I mean, these are, you'll see a lot of code that purports to be do no harm code. There's code that purports to be, you can't use it if you are a commercial entity. There's all sorts of different licenses that try to restrict either who can use it or fields of endeavor, and those aren't open source licenses. They don't follow the definition. You'll see people that try to say you can use it, but you can't make money off it. Again, that's inherent in both the four freedoms of Richard Stallman and in this, that I can use it for any means, and if I can get somebody to pay me for what is essentially open source, that's my prerogative. It's not necessarily a sustainable model if all you're doing is packaging up somebody else's code, but if you look at Red Hat, that's how Red Hat started out, right? They took a Linux distribution that was freely available and open source. Anybody could take it and download it, and they put it in a pretty package and made it easy for people to download, or easy for people to install and use, added documentation, added support, and they got sold to IBM for $4 billion just a few years ago. So, it can be a pretty lucrative way to make money. It's at least worth $4 billion. You'll see things where you have to come back to me for a license. That's not allowed. We'll talk about some other stuff maybe if we have time. I don't want to keep you too long on, we're going to try to keep this within a reasonable time frame for this discussion, and we're already getting there. All right, so these are all groups that have joined the OSI and participate in the OSI. RCOS participates in the OSI as an affiliate member. We're the first largely student-led organization to be a member. We're not the only college group to be a member, but we were the first student-led group to be a member. And now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. There are multiple places that purport to be open source licenses. There are a lot of licenses that purport to be open source. And like I said, there are violations of the basic open source definition in a lot of them. So actually reading through the legalese of a lot of these licenses is a fairly difficult thing. And quite honestly, as a not lawyer, and most of these licenses haven't been tested in court anyway, it is really difficult to know whether you're violating the open source principles. So from a practical standpoint, what we are going to require for this class is that you choose software distributed with an OSI approved license. OSI actually does litigate this stuff. They do have an approval process. You can submit a license for consideration. They'll go through, they try to keep the number of licenses from proliferating too much. It's really good if you can if there's a license that exists out there that meets your specific use case, and there are a lot of licenses out there that have an OSI approval. So it should be hopefully fairly easy for you to find a license within the subset of the OSI approved licenses that actually meets your use case. Quite honestly, if you have to go outside of this list, I would be pretty pretty surprised. Apache, BSD, MIT, they're considered permissive licenses. We'll talk about those in just a second, what the difference between permissive and copyleft are. GPL, LGPL, and the AGPL, which isn't on here, are copyleft or viral licenses. And I think Eclipse is somewhere between, and the Common Development and Distribution License, that one I don't remember, so I'm not really sure. And again, the OSI has their 10 principles, and when you submit a license, they go through the 10 principles, they open it up for community comments, and everybody can talk about whether they believe this license is or not an actual public license. And these are some of the discussions in 2020, well, from 2018 through 2020. This one was the server-side public license was the MongoDB license. That was never approved. It was actually withdrawn when Mongo decided that it was probably not going to be approved. All of these are discussions that have gone on the thread about whether a specific candidate for certification or for approval actually met the needs and was unique. Your biggest resource, what we're going to talk about, the biggest thing you want to do first is pick a category of license. And we'll talk about the categories. After that, pick one of the common licenses, hopefully one of these. OSI has commonly used licenses that you can pull down. And then go to TLDR Legal. So if you just come in and type in TLDR GPL, right? It'll take you to TLDR Legal, and it'll explain to you what the GPL license is. It'll give you this quick little summary at the top that tells you what you can do with it. Any open source license is going to be able to use commercial use. These are the things you can do with it. You can commercialize it, modify it, distribute it. You can place a warranty. You don't have to. And describes the rights, so practice patent claims. I'd have to read it to see exactly what that meant. Generally, that means that if I release code under an open source license and I put algorithms in there that I patented, I am also giving people the right to use and modify that patented code. But I would have to read that explicitly to make sure that that's what that means. GPL, you can't sublicense, which means you can't change the license. You can distribute it under the same license or a compatible license. And, you can't hold people liable if you get it. And then what you must do, can, cannot, must, okay? And all of these, they have one of these for every one of the licenses that are in, every one of the licenses you'll want to use will have this TLDR in it. We can look up Apache, for example, and we can spell Apache correctly. Right, and that's there as well. And you can get the full text of the licenses if you want to read them. All right, so that's just a little bit about the practicalities. And where to go for some help in figuring out what each one of the licenses means. These licenses have been tested, some of them. At least the general principle of open source has been tested in court. There's also been cases like Mongo asserting that the OSI doesn't have the right to say to the words open source approved or open source license. And that's kind of being argued out. OSI also does things like does amicus briefs for example, the recent decision on Google versus Oracle on the Java API front. So that's kind of what OSI does. And again, it's used in the EU as well, and I think my hidden slides are now back unhidden again, so I might be skipping over some of these slides. All right, so we've talked a little bit, just really briefly, about what licenses are. Let's talk about what they actually do. So there are multiple different types of licenses you can have, and the ones we're most concerned about are licenses that protect different forms of IP. So IP is intellectual property. It is the product of your mind, essentially. So, if I'm a widget builder, I can build a screwdriver maybe, and it can be the best screwdriver ever, and I can patent it. But, right, and that idea of how to build that screwdriver is patent IP. Every time I write something, whether I put an explicit copyright notice on it or not, that is under my copyright. So as soon as I write something, I own the copyright to that. There are some exceptions to that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And then the third type of IP is trademark, things that are used as shorthand to explicitly refer to a product. I think one of the oldest trademarks in existence is actually for Bass Ale. You can see it in some of the old masters paintings. You'll see pictures of the Bass Ale bottle with the red triangle. That's a trademark. Coca-Cola is a trademark. It's something that refers to shorthand for referring to a product, and you can register a trademark, and no one else can take it. Mickey Mouse, I believe, is a trademark of Disney. Our copyright law has been changed a bit to accommodate Disney because you can only trademark one or several things. You can't trademark everything you produce, so characters like Donald Duck and Goofy are not trademarkable as part of Disney. So they fall under copyright, and copyrights actually run out. So you'll see modifications to our copyright law that are designed to allow Disney exclusive access to Disney-created characters. Anyway, 3 different types of IP. A license, basically, the one we're going to be worried about is what a license does. And a license typically grants to the licensee some form of rights to use the IP, right? So your software licenses, if you've ever read an OILA, you'll find out that you have no rights. You don't even own the software. You are using the software, and you're allowed to use the software, but the company retains rights to the software. That's as far as your licensing goes. You don't actually own the software that you bought, and that's one of the things that the open source movement is kind of campaigning against. It also defines the responsibilities of the parties entering into the license agreement. So again, read your OILAs, because you have responsibilities to the software when you actually click that little "OK, I read it" button. So here's the things that are important. The scope, what is being licensed, and how can the IP be used and by who? How long? If I want to renew it, what are the conditions? If I drove around the block counterclockwise on Sundays, am I prohibited from renewing? Are there any conditions I have to meet to use? Like it can only be used on 3 computers in a company at a time, or else I have to pay an additional licensing fee. How are you protected against liabilities? How are the license terms enforced? License terms without any enforcement mechanism, really has no teeth. IP protection, am I giving you access to IP that I don't want you to distribute? And what happens if you distribute it to somebody else? Do you have protections in place, warranties, cost, and penalties for violations? Okay, so these are all things that are part of a license. Software, just like anything else, like any other IP, participates in this kind of thing, right? When you write it, you get copyright protection to it. You can embed within it trademarks referring to your company. You'll see in a lot of the licenses that you can use the Apache code, but you can't use the Apache trademark, for example. And sometimes there are even software patents for novel functionality or technologies that can be encoded in an algorithm and put into the code. So when you're looking at the license, right, you have this kind of Venn diagram of something you wrote can have a copyright, can be patentable, and can have a trademark. Now, if you're writing code, it's almost certainly going to have a copyright. The exceptions are, by the way, for the exception to the copyright is if, and this is in the United States only, in the EU this doesn't hold, but the exception to the copyright is if you are working for a government agency and being paid to produce something as part of your employment, then that whatever you produce is in the public domain, which means there is no copyright holder. So the U.S. federal government does not, that's why you can get all of this stuff from FOIA, is because, and you can FOIA code that the government has written by government employees in the performance of their duties. And as far as I know, that's the only real exception to the developer holding copyright. If I'm working for a company and I'm being paid to develop something, then I'm doing a work for hire, and depending on my contract, on my licensing agreement or my employment contract with my company, the company probably holds the IP. So if you're working for a company producing something, they probably hold the IP. If you're a contractor, that may not be the case. If you're being paid as a independent contractor, unless there's an explicit agreement for you to give the copyright over, you probably continue to hold the copyright to the code. All right. We have a few examples here, right? So this is probably copyright, right? Because it's a dictionary definition. Copyright, you hold the rights to the exact expression. So if you and I have two different ways of doing the same algorithm, the same general algorithm in a computer program, we could do it independently and we wouldn't be infringing each other's copyrights. If, however, I have a patent on the algorithm, then it's no longer a matter of just expression. It's a matter of, what the program actually does, and then you could be infringing my patent rights. These are just patent diagrams. I think this is for the internal workings of a mouse. Trademark, right? The Nike Swoop. Happy birthday to you is interesting because it used to be copywritten. And then they found out that the people who thought they owned the copyright, they found a predecessor song that used the same different lyrics, but the same song, and that kind of broke the whole copyright thing. So you may see Happy Birthday to You make its way back into being sung at restaurants and things like that instead of the other songs that have been sung in its stead. This is actually a patentable thing. It's a business process. Somehow along the way, the Patent Office decided that business processes could be patented. So this is how to answer a phone call and record patient information for the doctor to use later, essentially. Again, this is probably just a copyright. It's an expression of an idea. You can express similar ideas. You just can't copy the exact form. This looks like a make file. So copywritten. Yeah, it's a make file. Patrick uses Emacs apparently. Emacs is okay. VI is better. Anyway, so our whole goal with this, with doing these open source licenses, is we're trying to make something that allows people to have the freedoms either expressed in Richard Stallman's 4 freedoms or in the 10 principles of open source development by the OSI. And that's really the whole underlying idea here, is we're going to take code and we're going to make it so that although we hold the copyright, other people can use it consistent with the principles set out in the first couple of slides we had here today. This is kind of a flow chart of a traditional procurement process. And the thing you want to look at is identifying the software of interest and procuring the software. Right? You've got to go through and you've got to do a lot of evaluations on the software before you get to the part of actually procuring and then trying to use the software. And the thing here is that you buy the software first and then you use it. For open source licensing, open source code always comes with a permission to use, right? That's one of the first freedoms may be the first freedom. And it's one of the basic principles. It doesn't matter where you get the code from, you have the right to use it. So open source licensing always gives you the opportunity to use and evaluate the code first. If you're going to Red Hat to pay for a distribution, that's your choice. But you could just go to a download and get a free download of the Red Hat Linux distribution, and you're set anyway, right? The open source version. So you always have the permission to use the software first and evaluate. The licensing terms of open source software only kick in when you go to distribution. So in an open source code, I have the right to use it right from the start. I don't have to pay anything necessarily, right? If I'm buying it from Red Hat, they can require me to pay them before they give me the code, but they can't force me to pay them to acquire it from someplace else. Right? So you can always acquire the code, you can always use the code, and you can always modify the code for personal use. There are sometimes clauses that have to be obeyed on redistribution. And that's the only time that you're actually going to see much of a difference between any of the licenses. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And what the different licenses, what the differences are, is when you redistribute, do you have to redistribute changes you made, or can you hold those back? Is essentially, or how do you have to redistribute changes made? The other difference is what constitutes a redistribution. And some of the network licenses, like the AGPL, and some of the licenses, like the AGPL, using the software, making the software available on a server constitutes as a redistribution, right? So I can't say that I'm only keeping it on my machine. I developed it on my machine. I'm only using it on my machine, but I'm allowing other people to log in and have access to the code. That constitutes a redistribution. Some of the other licenses, that doesn't actually constitute a redistribution. All right. And where things get muddy is that all of these terms, you have to know what you're doing, right? If you're going to read through the entire license and pick a license, a random license from the internet, and there are lots of them out there with or without OSI approval, then you have to understand all of the terms in the license. BSD is either a 2 or 3 clause license. It's pretty short. MIT is really short. Not all of them are really short. And understanding exactly what they mean is complicated, which is why we have this licensing process. That's why we require you to pick something that OSI has already vetted, so that when we get into this situation, the project, you have licensed your project with a single clear OSI compliant license, and people know what that means, and they know how they're allowed to use it. We're not pulling any bait and switches. Gonna skip that. If you look at the open source development process, the scope is, a lot of these are already defined, right? Let's see. These 3 are basically ignored, right? If you're open source licensing it, anyone can use it for any purpose in perpetuity, and there's no renewal because in perpetuity is forever. There's no indemnification in general, which means that you get the software as is. You don't have the right to go back and make them change it to meet your needs. Generally, conditions of use on distribution, you have to cite the people you used. You probably can't use other people's trademarks. And then we'll talk a little bit about copyleft versus permissive to come. Audit, source code is available, license included. Patent protection, IP protection. If you have concerns about patents getting into your code, you can pick a license that handles that part of it. There may be a payment option. A lot of companies actually like having somebody to pay for open source software. Basically what they're paying for is for you to configure it, give it to them, and then support it. That way they don't have to train up their own, open source software can be complicated. That way they don't have to train up their own individuals. And there are a whole lot of purported benefits. Okay, so you can look through those. If you think about open source for a while, you can probably come up with, even more for these. The big ones that get pulled out often are higher quality. They tend to have fewer bugs. They tend to have fewer security holes. Bugs will be discovered in an active project. Bugs will be discovered and fixed more quickly. Where there's greater security somewhere in here, greater security. And generally, they're faster. If you have an active community, they can generally go faster than a company developing things. So you start seeing, for example, on Apple with the iPhone, Android is actually making some big inroads. And the reason is there's all sorts of companies collaborating on Android. The iPhone has to keep jumping ahead and has to, put ever more resources into developing the next product in order to actually stay ahead of the curve. So that all sounds like a beautiful, lovey-dovey community. Not quite. Mostly it is, but you'll see a lot of little fights about reciprocal, GPL, permissive versus copyleft. So let's just talk about those quickly as well. So copyleft is a general method for making a program free. Right? This is essentially out of the Richard Stallman camp. It's a philosophical movement. So from a philosophical standpoint, Copyleft believes that all code must be free. So if you use my code, as a condition of using my code, you have to make your code free as well. And that's all that the Copyleft means. By allowing you to use my code, I am requiring that you do the same, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, kind of thing. The permissive license, and that had, particularly early on, that has a lot of issues with places like companies where they're trying to preserve, the secret sauce kind of thing. What stuff do we do uniquely that we don't want to give away? So so the next generation of licenses, or the next generation, is a less philosophical and more pragmatic movement, and it says open source software is just better. So therefore, anybody with half a brain is going to want to release their stuff open source because it's just the right way to do things and it makes better software. So therefore, we don't have to require people to make it free. We can let them do whatever they want, and the free versions are going to win. So a permissive license has minimal requirements about how the software can be used and redistributed. And for example, you can take something distributed with a permissive license, you can package it up and put a non-permissive license on it, and as long as you follow the rules of the game, which is generally attributing code to who wrote it, you can actually sell that without making it open source, without open sourcing anything else. And you'll find this in a lot of like the TiVo boxes, right? They all run Linux, but you can't get the source for what's running in the TiVo boxes. Although Linux, by the way, is generally a GPL, so that was actually a lawsuit. But the idea is you can include it in a commercial product without necessarily revealing all of the code. The thing is that the permissive license applies at the time it was released, right? So you can always go back. If I'm evil company B and I make a lot of changes, you can always go back and get the original version, and then just you don't get the benefit of my hidden secret changes, but you can always start from my precursor and continue development on the project. Free is free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. That's a Stallmanism. So in other words, it's like an idea. An idea once set free is allowed to be free, but I can pay to have that. I can require you to pay to get it from me, is the kind of thing. And this seems like a pretty big divide, but in reality, free software and open source stand for almost the same range of programs. This is from Richard Stallman, who is, again, a philosophical opponent of open software. The acknowledgement here is that from a practical standpoint, an open source license and a free license, something that is approved by Stallman, is essentially the same thing. The software is essentially almost all the software licensed as open source actually meets the free software definition. But the difference is what is the philosophical standpoints. Are you pragmatically saying, are you being pragmatic about it, or are you essentially saying that and I lost my page, that we want to work with companies and we're going to sacrifice some of our beliefs in order to make a bigger market. And that's kind of the trade-off, right? The open source movement wants to bring everybody into it with the idea that eventually open source software will take over the world, and the free software people are more pure philosophically. They want people to take things on their own terms, and if you're not willing to play the game with them, then you shouldn't have access to their software. If you want a reciprocal license, if you want somebody who uses your code to have to make their changes public when they release, again, only when they release, you want to look at probably one of the Copyleft licenses, the GPL or the AGPL. If you're kind of in the mood, if you want to be very permissive and you want to let people, take your code and you've put your code out there, you want to put it out there and let people use it, then you probably want to choose one of the permissive licenses. I'd recommend Apache, BSD, or MIT. There's 2-clause and 3-clause BSD. I think the 3-clause is probably better. But MIT and Apache are also very good licenses. I've used all 3 of these. I've used some of these. I don't like the AGPL particularly just because it's really legalese written and it's harder to read. And then in the middle are licenses that require you to do some things, but are kind of looser on how you can use their code. For example, the LGPL loosens up some of the requirements. So if you link to a library using shared, if you link to a library, a GPL library, LGPL library in your code, that doesn't necessarily mean that your code has to be licensed under GPL. And there are, and again, these only apply when you're doing derivative works, right? So it only kicks in when you've modified the code. That's a derivative work, and then when you redistribute it, like the terms kick in when you redistribute. The terms kick in when you redistribute, even if you don't have a derivative work. So here, Copyleft, you create a derivative work. You must honor the reciprocity provision and publish the source code of your derivative works that you distribute. For permissive license, generally what you have to do is attribute the original portions of the license code to the original developers. Okay? And again, both of these only apply upon distribution. We talked about TLDR legal. This is the MIT license. The only things you have to do is include the copyright and include the license when you distribute, for the parts that you didn't change. GPL, right? You have to include the original, state changes, disclose source, include license, include copyright, include installation instructions. There's a few more musts, and you can't sub-license it. So the sub-licensing is where you can change the license. All right. The last topic, and I know we're right up against the hour. This would have been good if I hadn't, if my pictures were showing up in the original form. Last topic I want to talk about is I want to circle back to this public domain. You can say that your code is in public domain. This is, from a legal perspective, right? It's where no copyright rights exist. If you write something and you want to put it in the public domain, you actually have to put a license on it. Because copyright does not disappear just because you don't put the little C in a circle underneath, on the document. Public domain software means that anybody can use it. So if you actually do have public domain software, something written by the government, for example, it's not actually free and open source, right? Because since the source isn't published, evil corporation can take it in. This is saying U.S. Forest Service develops some code. The code gets put into the public domain. Evil corporation E, and you may recognize that kind of logo, takes the code, doesn't even necessarily have to change it, and then a few years later, or a few weeks later, sells it back to the Forest Service again, right? They have no reason, no requirement to disclose the source code, even though it's public domain. So this can be an endless cycle of taking code and selling it again with no recourse from the Forest Service, who just doesn't have the resources to know that they're getting the same code over and over again. What I worry about more is faux public domain. When you write a copyright, when you write code, you have the copyright. If you put code out there into GNU or into GitHub and you let people use it, just because people can see your code doesn't give them the right to download it. And by the way, this has happened on OpenStack. We'll talk about that in just a second. You haven't actually given them rights to use your code. You've made it so they can use your code. They have the ability to use your code. They can go in and look at it, but you haven't necessarily given them rights to it. So let's say you write some really popular piece of code. You solve some world problem that's been just waiting to be solved forever. You put it out on GitHub, and millions of people download it and incorporate it into their products, but you never actually licensed it. If you're evil, you can go out then and, if you're a patent troll, for example, you can then go out and assert your copyright on that code, and actually have a possibly winnable lawsuit. You will have to prove that it's yours. You have to have that you didn't license it, etc. But that's the issue. The open source tells people how they can use your code, and it gives them the intellectual freedom to know, to abide by the rules and know that they're doing the right thing when they're using your code. And that's, if you are actually going out on GitHub and you find code that's not licensed, I wouldn't use it. One, it's probably not of high quality, but two, that there is this issue that, there is the possibility of somebody else, pulling a trick on you or something. And this was actually a part in Stack Overflow. There's actually a suit where somebody working, I think it was Nissan, took some code off of Stack Overflow and included it in his distribution. And the code, at that point, there was no license on code available on Stack Overflow. So it actually ended up in a lawsuit, and I believe he lost. Since that time, I believe Stack Overflow has changed it so that now when you post code, you are actually giving a right to use to the people who see it. I'm not going to talk about which license is best because it depends on what you're trying to accomplish and whether you're philosophically bent or whether you're pragmatically bent. If you want larger adoption, you want to go more, if you don't care other people use your code and you want large adoption, you want, GM to pick it up and then hire you as a consultant because you've written such wonderful stuff, then you want to do it under a permissive license. If you don't really care about how far it gets distributed, so long as it's philosophically pure, then you want to go GPL or AGPL. If you're in the middle, there's some things you want to be restricted, then take a look at one of the intermediate licenses. All communities are welcome to make their own decision. And by the way, you are welcome to make a decision to not use an open source license any place but this course, right? It's always your option when you've written the code and you hold the copyright. It's your option to license it how you want. I think that it's best to license it correctly under an open source license because they have specific meanings and it does actually benefit the community and allows us to speak with one mind. When you start talking about things like some of the ethical licenses, you come down to who gets to decide, right? So people who are using your code may one day be working on ethical things and then without changing what they're working on, all of a sudden be not working on ethical things based on the mores of current movements. So it adds confusion and uncertainty and actually puts people, if you allow arbitrary decisions about things like that, it does actually put people at risk. So, from a standpoint of this class, you have to use open source. I would encourage you to use open source for all of your endeavors. But if you don't, that is actually your option, because you own the copyright. You can license it as you want. You can't give it to, you have to abide by the community you're in. If you're contributing to a specific project, but to contribute or not to contribute is also your decision. All right. The only other thing to look at maybe is this compatibility chart. If you start out permissive and you do some development, you can end up licensing it permissive, copyleft, or proprietary. So if you do permissive and you're only working with permissive stuff, the default license is permissive. Downstream, you can make it whatever you want. If you have permissive and copyleft code, and you're going to bring them together into a product, that product has to be copyleft, and anything that goes forward has to be copyleft as well. You've kind of locked off everything. If you take in permissive into a proprietary product, well, a proprietary product, you're never releasing source again. So until you decide to make this non-proprietary, right? You can't even use it for another company. Somebody else can't use it for other proprietary purposes. So this is just kind of the compatibility chart. This is what you start with. This is how you do your work. The product you come up with, and this is what can be used in the end. I think I'm going to stop there. We've been long enough. Patrick goes into a whole lot of way things are not open source, and people who are trying to trick you into thinking things are open source. It's one of the reasons we really want you to use an open source license, because there's things like the Sailfish license, the JOLA tablet, all of which said they were open source, that aren't actually open source, even remotely. So just be careful, keep your eyes open, use a common open source license, and I think you'll be good. All right, I'm going to just open this up for quick questions, and then I will let you guys go. And I'm sorry this went on a little longer than I intended it to. Any questions, any comments? All right, let me take a quick screenshot of this so that I get all of your names.
I actually did have a quick question.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, I love answering questions.
Cool stuff. At some point, perhaps in the beginning of the semester or otherwise, I don't remember even who said it, but at some point in this class, I've heard that new projects should use the MIT license.
Okay.
Is that something you recommend, or was that said by somebody else, you think, or?
That may have been said by me, and the way I've phrased it is, if you want to make $1 billion on your project when you get out of RCOS, look at the terms under which you want to use it when you're no longer a student. If you're doing this for philosophical reasons, any of the GPLs are good. The MIT is really non-restrictive. So that means that when you graduate, you could take something that's licensed under MIT, and you can immediately pull it proprietary and start working on it, and you never have to release anything you do past that point again. Or you can maintain it as MIT, or you can take it into GPL. So in the context of what I was talking about, it was just that from the standpoint of downstream, staying with a permissive license like MIT allows you to delay that decision as long as possible. I have no problems with using something like a GPL or anything like that. I'm perfectly happy with those. It was purely from a pragmatic standpoint. If you're starting a project and you don't know what else to do, and you license at MIT, you can always change the license at a later date, and everything past that point will be GPL or proprietary or whatever you want. Okay?
Fantastic, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, any more questions? If not, I'm turning off the recording. And again, I apologize for running as long as I did. I expected to be done in 45 minutes. But sometimes it goes longer. All right, we'll talk to you. And you should be grateful that I didn't run all 180 slides that Patrick had. I hope you found it useful. Bye.